Today we're going to be discussing food and capitalism, and the main source of information that I'm deriving the lecture from is Eric Holt Gimenez. This is A Foodie's Guide to Capitalism, and although we're going to be looking at the chapters, the introduction, chapter 1 and chapter 2, I'm also going to be bringing in other information, and I'm going to draw off of what Eric Holt Gimenez is discussing and actually go through some of the theories that he's deriving some of this information from. So mainly, if you've actually read the book or those chapters especially, a lot of the information is derived from a context of political economy. So basically looking at kind of stemming from Adam Smith, Ricardo, and kind of the foundational political economists, but then actually looking at Marx's critique of capitalism and then rooting the understanding of food and capitalism through Marx's critique of capitalism. So the starting point of, I think, where we should begin is actually looking at food commodities. Okay, so what is a food commodity? Well, we could look at this picture here that I have. What is this? Okay. Now, we kind of take food for granted a lot of the time, and we don't necessarily always try to deconstruct what food really is. You know, we go and purchase things at a grocery store. Some of the things are packaged. Some of them are actually, you know, in their whole kind of context. But what we're doing is we're actually producing food commodities in the way that, you know, we're producing food for markets and for people to be purchasing. We're not necessarily producing it communally as much as, you know, as the capitalist food system produces food as commodities. So what is a food commodity? Well, you know, if you're looking at critiques by Vandana Shiva, she's gonna basically say is that it's not real food that we're eating. We're actually eating fake food. So we're fake in the way of, you know, GMOs. What we're doing is we're actually splicing certain sections of DNA and we're putting them into our food, basically, you know, cutting different strands of different species or, you know, even the same species and manipulating the genetic structures of food. So it actually is not a natural product anymore. It becomes something that has been, you know, something that has been processed in different degrees, scientifically processed, but also, you know, in the case of KFC, sometimes even cooked and transformed in other ways. So, you know, food is not necessarily a natural thing anymore. And sometimes it becomes quite abstracted to the extent that we kind of lose the vision as to what we're actually eating and what is it, you know, how do we define food? How does it that these things become food items? So KFC is a really good example, and I pulled this for a very specific purpose, okay? Because KFC is about to launch this big thing right now, is that they're going to be 3D printing food using bioprinting. So what does this mean altogether is through a 3D printing machine, they can actually take cells of whatever it is that they're trying to incorporate. Here it's chicken. And what they're going to do is actually combine this with plant cells and be able to print through bioprinting these kind of food items. Okay. Now, why is this important here is because it seems that there's been a lot of discussion about the ethics involved in bioprinting in a way that, you know, this is being championed by certain individuals is this is how we actually protect the environment and this is how we protect animals because now we don't have to kill chickens. What we can do is just take a sample of their DNA and basically their cell tissue. And, you know, in different petri dishes, we could actually then grow different cells and bacteria and other things like that and transform them into food items and basically 3D print food. So some people will say, well, you know, this is great because this is going to help us with food production. We can start printing food in places in the world and make it really cheap for individuals and we'll all be able to eat food. And, you know, other people, like I said, are going to champion this is less cruel to chickens and to cows and other things like that. Now, you know, as great as this may sound, or, you know, as kind of devious as this may sound, I don't want us to look at this as like a good or a bad thing, but let's actually deconstruct this and let's look at what we're really doing here, okay? So first of all, is this real food? It's quite debatable. We're actually creating this in a lab. We're growing cells and then transforming it into something to replicate the idea of having chicken. So yes, it might have the same structures as a chicken that's, you know, raised and farmed and killed, but it's very different in the way that we're actually producing these things in a lab. Now, does this make it good or bad? Well, you know, if we don't think of it in those terms, what we could say is what are the consequences of these kind of things? Well, what is the goal of this? Okay, so the goal usually of commodifying food is not necessarily to be able to feed everybody, which is sometimes the case of what people are describing is that, yes, we could actually have 3D printing technology and feed people in countries where they're malnourished or other things like that. But the goal of KFC is not necessarily to do that, okay? Their goal really is to commodify a food ingredient, or basically a food product, and then to sell it in markets and make sure that they're able to do this very cost-effective manner and be able to accrue as much surplus in the context, okay? But what is this going to do in the bigger picture? So does this actually feed the world? And this is a very important thing to address, because right now we're trying to feed malnourished people. There's about 800 million people starving throughout the world. But the issue is not about production. It's actually about distribution and also about equality and other political and economic factors. Because if we could feed the world over about 1.5 times over, well, it's not necessarily, the problem is not rooted in production, but it's rooted in other things. So what is this going to do, really, is actually it's going to be able to give KFC the ability to start patenting different technologies. So they could patent their use of these 3D printing technologies and actually some of the bio materials that they're using. So some of the cell structures and other genetic structures of the plant. Basically, they're going to make a very mechanized process of producing this food, to drive down labor costs as much as they can, really, and then be able to accrue surplus as in the biggest capacity possible. So what is this really doing? Is this helping nourish people? Well, arguably, it's not actually even addressing the right problem. So there are other issues that may come up also. People might say, well, this is better for animals, this is better for the environment. Not necessarily, okay? There are ways of engaging with the environment where agriculture is actually more beneficial. So agriculture, if done properly, could actually sequester carbon. We could create carbon sinks by planting perennial plants and trees and other things like that, and actually kind of reduce the carbon emissions that are coming in the world by actually addressing it through agriculture. Well, these things are not necessarily being addressed this way. The other argument too is actually a lot of people are afraid of this kind of food. And actually a spokesperson from KFC went and did a press release basically saying in Australia, we're not using these technologies, we're only going to be using live chickens, and kind of dealing with public backlash on this big topic here. Anyway, so these are things to be aware of, because these are conversations that are going to come up about being sustainable. So people are going to say cultured meat is more sustainable. And my argument is, well, maybe not, because sustaining ourselves has to do with food access. And what happens in the commodification process is you start to restrict food access. So by patenting different things, you restrict people from being able to get them. And by putting things through market means that actually people that don't have the access to either afford your food or to access markets will not be able to get it either. So there are conditions that come up that actually, first of all, this doesn't solve the bigger issue of feeding the world. But then second of all, there are other issues that come up, especially in the way of restriction. And patenting technologies, patenting genetic structures and GMOs and all these other things restrict people from actually getting them. So that's one thing. So I think this is a really good example to anchor this idea of a commodity. So what really is a commodity, and how do we understand commodities, and how is food in this commodified process? But how is it not also? So food is not just a commodity. Food actually occurs naturally. So, we could think of this as a fictitious commodity that I'm going to get back to later on. But we don't need labor to make food. It could exist on itself in a natural process and actually will, flourish in certain environments without any human intervention. So certain trees will produce fruit. The fruit will, flourish, and then, the fruits will fall if they're not harvested, and, maybe produce different trees because the seeds will actually be implanted in the ground and food will produce itself. So we don't need human intervention to have food, and we don't need to highly process food. But, I guess when people are looking at the big conditions of food, what their main question is, well, how do we feed the, 7 billion people on this planet? And that's quite a complex question. But getting down to it, I would say that, these kind of mechanisms of commodification, especially in the way of, patenting and having all these high technologies and printing processes and using biocells and all this stuff, is going to be more restricting than it is going to be allowing people to eat across the world. So if we want to break this down at a starting point, we could look at what a commodity. Okay, so commodity substance is a product that could be traded, bought, or sold. It's a product that contains some kind of a value. And we're going to deconstruct what we mean by value. So it's a raw material or primary agricultural product that can be bought, sold, such as copper or coffee. We can look at this as something that goes to market, something that is mass produced, something that is useful or valuable. But basically the idea of this is that there are conditions that bring this into the market, and there are conditions of labor that go into the commodification process. So we're going to deconstruct what we mean by the value of a commodity, okay? But kind of, I guess, the general aspect here that I want to drive home is that commodity is something that is produced mainly through labor, and that is brought to a market to be bought, sold, and traded. Excuse me. Okay, so if we look at this in a different question, so what is the value of KFC? And, at base value, you might say, oh, whatever, this is worth 20 bucks. Or, we could even look at different forms of value that are maybe not necessarily monetary forms. You could look at the usefulness of this. For myself, this is not very useful as a product because I don't eat meat. So I will not find this, a use value for myself. Although, other people that do eat meat might actually find this quite useful for them because this might sustain their subsistence and be able to, perpetuate. Although I would beg to differ about how many vitamins and nutrients are in KFC altogether, as opposed to calories and other things that are harmful for us. But, we're not going to get at that right now. There are other values that KFC discuss also. And actually, if you click on this link here, you're going to see a whole bunch of different moral values that come into play. So KFC has looked on their website, have social values, they have environmental values, they care about us, and they care about the environment, just pretty much like any major company at the present moment. All the national or multinational companies claim in their best interest that they're looking out for all of us and they're looking out for the environment, okay? They also talk about a whole bunch of other moral values as well. So basically kind of more of a branding campaign about how do we define KFC and what is it that KFC really means, okay? So to look at this, when we're actually looking at KFC, it's quite complex to figure out what kind of food this is because a lot of the understanding about the food has nothing to do with the tangible food item itself, but more of an idea. Okay, so Colonel Sanders, they're branding off this person that I'm actually not too familiar with what his identity is in the company itself, but anyhow, he's somebody that probably made their food a long time ago or was one of the company owners or whatever. We could check that out through KFC. But anyways, it's kind of the face of this operation. So, they're branding off of an individual who is Colonel Sanders, as well as all of this kind of marketing material that went into what KFC means. So we have an understanding of KFC in its tangible form of like what we can see here is like a chicken item or French fries, but also there's all of these other ideas that come into play that have been reinforced through marketing and basically kind of go in with this value situation that they're trying to describe as what the company really means. Okay, so if anybody's in marketing, what you do in marketing to kind of promote a brand is to have a brand identity that's kind of like a personality, and then describe the brand through all these kind of personality traits, and then link them on to all these social values. Okay, so what is the social value? Well, KFC could be like a picnic snack, or it could be things that are performative in different ways, or some kind of a lifestyle thing that you bring around to different occasions, or whatever the case is. I myself haven't eaten KFC in like a long time, so I'm not much, or I guess this doesn't really have much use value to me, but for a lot of people it does, and some people, maybe even the class or people listening to this may eat KFC and actually have use value and understand something about the product that's meaningful for them. Okay, it might be tangible, but it might not be tangible either. So what determines the value of a commodity? And it seems actually quite trivial at the beginning when we're actually looking at this. Well, yeah, the value is like $20, or the value could be these moral values that KFC talk about that is now reinforced by their marketing and their branding. But if we deconstruct this, actually, what we're going to realize here is the value of a commodity is the extent of its relationship to money, so that we could actually determine a monetary value to it. But at the same time, also has other components that determine its usefulness and other conditions of labor that have to go into making this product. So to start, is a good place to look is actually Marx's starting point of the circulation of commodities. So what is a commodity and how does this relate to capitalism? Well, this is kind of the primary thing that is entered into engagement with the market, or basically exchange, so that people could then get value out of it by purchasing it, or basically, by bringing it to market and actually accruing more value by selling it and by manufacturing. Okay. So we could look at the circulation of commodities, and if we're looking at kind of the divide or the development of capitalism and how food fits into that, capitalism developed around the 1600s onwards. Okay, and there's no specific date, and depending on where you are in the world, there's different instances of where capitalism has developed at different speeds. But starting mainly in Europe, and a lot of the political economy is quite Eurocentric when it comes to their understanding of how the world has functioned. We could see the development of capital. So what were kind of previous notions of how people obtained things, and stemming back to Karl Polanyi, which here I kind of quoted a little bit at the bottom, and what we've talked about in other courses, is it seems that actually redistribution and reciprocity were main factors driving economic involvement. Okay? It wasn't markets. It's back before the 1600s-ish. Not to say that markets didn't exist. They did. Okay? But they weren't the determining factor of how the economy was defined. It was actually other things like, in feudal societies, you had the feudal lords that would collect taxes or take things from people and have some kind of a redistributive process. Okay? I'm not saying it was fair because, in feudal times, the equality was very difficult to maintain. The other aspect was about reciprocity. So people grew their own food. They were attached more to the conditions of their survival and actually operated more in communities, shared with each other and other things like this. So I'm not saying that one thing is better than another necessarily, but we have to deconstruct these things to understand where we've got to now and what are some of the conditions that exist presently and how is this affecting our understanding of sustainability. So look, before the circulation of capital, we have exchanges that could take place. So basically we could have commodities exchanging with commodities. So this is basically considered a barter system. I could have shoes and I could trade them for, some kind of food items, like let's just say sugar or apples or whatever the case is. So usually what happens is people are actually manufacturing some kind of a thing, but on their own or with small groups of people, and could barter with other people and bring their commodities to another group and start exchanging them with this other group. Now, our system has developed a little bit past that because what we've done is we've invented something called money, which actually is the way that, we facilitated commodity exchange, but also determines the value of the commodities as well. So here, like in a barter system with money, now what we're doing is we have a commodity that we start with, so we could exchange this with some kind of money that determines the value of the commodity, and then the idea basically is that would exchange then again for another commodity, and it facilitates the circulation of commodities through money. But the idea here is basically it's just kind of an extension of a barter network. But what Marx points out in Capital, especially Capital Volume 1, is actually the conditions for an extended barter system doesn't necessarily function like that. What happens really is the barter system's flipped on its head as soon as you put money into the equation. So what happens is you're not usually starting with a commodity, but you're starting with money, and people that are capitalists will actually take their money and buy labor power and the means of production and kind of put that into motion and then develop commodities from it, okay? And from commodities, what they're trying to do is they're actually trying to sell their commodities for more money. So they're trying to accrue here more value from the commodity that originally was necessary to make the commodity exist. So we started with a very simple barter system, but the introduction of money made it complex to the extent that it's no longer about ending a transaction based on exchanging one thing for another, but the transaction then ends with something that is actually more value than we began with. So basically capital growth, okay? Now in a capitalist system, what happens is that we don't end there, but the system restarts again. So what we do is we take this money and then we buy labor power and the means of production and then throw that back into productive mechanism and then start to produce more commodities like that and then accrue more money. So it's a system that has perpetual growth. And actually, there is no limitation to the growth except for some kind of physical means or other things. Actually, David Harvey identifies certain barriers to capital growth. But the idea here, and especially in a system where money is now just kind of financial transactions on paper, and even in other forms of commodities could be traded without any kind of physical nature to them. So basically, knowledge could derive or could be exchangeable, and actually could be something that's limitless. But things like oil or things that are physical commodities that actually have a certain amount that is fixed in our economies actually do put some limits on capital. Anyhow, but the system of capital accumulation is a limitless system and actually tries to assume everything into the system itself. So what does that mean? If people are outside that system, okay, for example, if you look at the especially extraction resources or pipeline building, some of the people living in certain nations or certain parts of Canada or the United States or really all over the world are living more symbiotically with nature and actually producing things more communally. Until some kind of like resource extraction company comes and then wants to uproot social systems and basically their production and their livelihoods by building pipelines or removing coal or fracking or whatever the case is. But what they're trying to do is say, you know what, that's great. Your form of life was acceptable until the moment that we actually want to switch everything or to convert everything into capital. So we're going to commodify and we're going to extract resources and make them into capital production when in certain cases that wasn't the conditions of how people are actually living there. So I'm going to get into this a little bit more into when we actually describe Marx's dialectic in Capital Volume 1. And I'm going to get a little bit into this, but it's quite complex altogether. So I've also provided some resources for you to get a bigger picture if you want to. Before that, though, it is very interesting to look at Polanyi's arguments as well. So Karl Polanyi wrote The Great Transformation, and in that book, he looks at what they call fictitious commodities. So he's discovered that there are certain commodities or things that we've commodified in capitalism that actually don't even fit the definition of a commodity, okay? So he calls them fictitious commodities. Although these things have been commodified, there are certain repercussions to commodifying these things here. So land. Polanyi argues, quite succinctly that land itself is not necessarily something that's produced through labor. It actually exists outside of it. So the commodifying land is something that is not necessarily, land is not produced for the market itself, but we have put it to the market to attempt to commodify it through, our definition of private property and other things. But it doesn't fit the conditions of a commodity, and actually is, has a lot of implications as to how commodities or how capitalism or other systems function. You need aspects of living on the land, and you need to be able to produce food in order to sustain yourself. And as soon as you're removed from these conditions, then basically people are forced into putting their labor towards capitalism to sustain themselves and rely on market principles rather than being able to do this communally or through our own labor. The second thing is labor itself. So he says labor is a fictitious commodity. Yes, we've commodified our own labor, and this is the extent of capital, is that people have been removed from their common lands and have been removed from feudal societies and basically forced into labor markets. In the early days, depending on where you are in the world, but at the beginning of capitalism, this was not a process that was a very clean process. It was quite a violent process where people were actually expropriated or removed quite violently from their land. And things that were set up were called enclosures. So agriculture became part of the capitalist system, and people were shut out of lands that was arable lands in order to grow their own food, but basically were then either employed or had to go to cities for other work. But basically what they were doing in agriculture communally or in feudal societies was no longer possible. So they were forced off their land. And basically, this is where we have a separation from people being able to produce themselves to then relying and having to commodify their labor, because no longer could we actually produce ourselves, our communities, and our families. But then we have to rely on capitalists, or basically employers, to employ us in order to get food so that we could purchase food commodities off the market. So Polanyi says that labor is a fictitious commodity also, And by us commodifying it, it has major ramifications. Basically, we're separating ourselves from our conditions of livelihood. The other thing is money. So money is not produced for value itself, but is actually the storer of value and the means of circulation. It's the way that we could actually understand the relationship between commodities, because we determine value by their financial value, which is usually in the equation of money. And all of these things have kind of an impetus for us to understand how food is developed in capitalism, because by separating the people from their land, they had to go towards labor and work for capitalist institutions in order to be able to maintain their livelihoods, which makes us very subservient to people in business and in capitalism. If we are trying to think outside of that, a lot of times we can't actually maintain our livelihood, and therefore we'll starve or we'll have major repercussions from it. And then in order to get some kind of fruits of our labor, we're not actually given any kind of products or even shares of the products, but what we are given is money. And with that money, we have to go and purchase all the things that are necessary for us to survive and to flourish. Polanyi didn't describe this, but I think it's interesting to look at food in that context also. So food is not produced always for our, for the commodification, but food exists naturally without our intervention. So food has existed before we came around and discovered the things that are edible. And, we don't need to go make a food forest. They exist in nature also. I guess the major issue is we have a lot of people that live in urban environments, and in order to have access to food, we need other conditions of production. Food fits into the commodification system, but also could be thought of outside of that. And actually, if we're looking at reappropriating and re-understanding food, especially in our political economic system, we could look at it as a decommodified process, trying to get back to connecting with our livelihoods and connecting with our communities as a way out of this kind of big capitalist food system. So we're going to start from deconstructing Marx's theory of value. And just to show you here, this is actually a snippet taken from David Harvey, and it's a very interesting way to understand Marx's dialectic, and especially just kind of the primary dialectic in Capital Volume 1. Now, just to show you, and not to scare you here, but the dialectic of Capital Volume 1 is a lot more than what I'm showing you in the previous slide. So there's actually quite a big chaining of dialectical processes that come in, basically starting at looking at a commodity and then basically looking at the end, kind of resolving into this class struggle. In this class here, we're not going to get into all of these things because this actually, you look at David Harvey's lectures or other things that I've actually put up here for your interest if you want to go check it out. It's actually quite a long explanation and quite detailed and nuanced. So, I would highly recommend that you check out David Harvey and, even read Capital Volume 1 or the Grand Risset and follow along with his lectures because they're really interesting and you'll probably learn a lot from it. But anyhow, so let's start from this understanding of value, okay? So Marx starts Capital with basically just from the commodity form. So his main question is, what is a commodity and how does this exist? And how do we understand a commodity? And how have all of these things that go into defining the value of a commodity been abstracted so much that we don't necessarily think about these things when we're defining value? When we go into a grocery store, where a lot of the time we're comparing prices, but we're not really thinking about what goes into all of these things that actually determine prices. Sometimes we do if it's completely obvious. We can look at supply and demand, and when we have oversupply of food, well then the prices tend to go down. If it's demand and there's not very much supply, we can see prices also fluctuate depending on supply and demand. But if we're actually looking at valuing a commodity, we have to also look at other things that go into the production of value, and mainly what they call socially necessary labor, okay? So in order to produce a commodity, we need to inject labor into it, or labor is the kind of driving force of commodity production. You'll probably understand that very well in the times of COVID, because a lot of the companies that were suggesting that everybody goes back to work, capitalists know very well that if people are not working for them, then the value is not being produced, okay? And billionaires I know have a big problem when their laborers do not go and produce value for them. because then value is not created and they can accrue their surpluses. But capital itself is subservient to labor and have managed to convince people of the opposite. Anyhow, so if we're going to look at a commodity, a lot of the time what happens is that we go to define the value of a commodity, skip all of these things, and just determine its money value, and basically kind of in the way of a price. But there's other things that go into determining this value. So what is it that we look for when we're trying to value commodity, or what does Marx explain some of the factors that come into the value of this commodity? So every commodity has a use value and an exchange value. Okay? If a commodity is not useful for you, it will not have an exchange value because you will not want it particularly. Although the commodity that's not useful for you may have exchange value for other people. Okay? Now, it seems kind of trivial, I guess, or I don't know, maybe you haven't thought about this, but a lot of people think about the commodity's use value and its utility and think that that's actually what the value of the commodity then is. Okay? So for example, this thing is very useful for me and everybody probably wants this thing, therefore its value is probably quite high. But that's not necessarily the case. Okay? So its use value only determines that it's actually going to be able to be valued of some sort, because if it has no use value, then it's very hard to make an exchange value. But in order for value to exist, that both of these things have to exist, but the exchange value is where value manifests. Okay? So we think of the value of a commodity based on its utility, because it has to have utility, but in order to then quantify the value of it, it has to be brought to market in order to be exchanged. And this is when the value manifests. Okay? So I guess to take a step back quickly here, this is a dialectic understanding, and Marx and Engels wrote a lot about Hegelian dialectics, or basically kind of resolving from a thesis to an antithesis, and the resolution is where we're looking at resolving the conflict between these thesis and the antithesis. So Marx uses dialectic theory in order to argue his points in Capital. Some people say that maybe that was a flawed process, and other people would say, that they did quite a great job of doing that through dialectics. Anyhow, I'm not going to judge necessarily or get into that larger picture, but just to present to you that this is how they're looking at describing value through dialectic theory. Okay. The commodity has use value. It also has an exchange value. The use value doesn't actually determine much except for that it is useful, and that's a starting point. But then its exchange value is what is measurable. So this produces value. But the thing that produces value has to have socially necessary labor time. So in order to produce an item of value, people have to construct it or work on it, or mine things or harvest things or whatever the case is. So it needs socially necessary labor. We need to be producing things in order for them to come into existence as a commodity. Okay, like I told you before, is that certain things are outside of the realms of commodities because they actually produce themselves. But here we're talking about a commodity. We need socially necessary labor time in order to produce these commodities. So what kind of socially necessary labor time do we need? Well, we have kind of concrete particular labor, which means that we all go to produce something that's tangible. You have a specific job that you're doing, and your physical labor is doing something that's tangible, could be measured, could be monitored, but is not necessarily reflective of the bigger picture, okay? Because we don't look at the value of a commodity based on one particular labor form, but we're actually abstracting this into the context of how does labor exist in general, and how do these commodities that come into existence, what socially necessary labor time creates all of these values that come into our world. So, very correctly speaking, when Marx is describing a commodity, he's saying that there's a relationship between all these things that have come into the world. So there's, all of the things of our production, we're producing food, we're producing cars, we're producing, electronics, whatever the case is. And all of these things go to form abstract labor. Okay? Socially necessary labor means that if we want to have a capitalist society based on exchange, then it's socially necessary for everybody or most of the people to take part in the production process in order to have all of the commodities that we have basically, for exchange or at our fingertips here. So there's a concrete factor that comes in, which means that yes, we need to produce something, and it's tangible to the extent of one person could do it. But that doesn't define labor, because we have different conditions of labor that have been abstracted, okay? And these, depending on the products and depending on where you are in the world, there are different conditions of labor that go into this. So we're going to deconstruct this a little bit more later on, but in order to kind of complete the discussion about the commodity and money form, we also have to bring these values in to exchange. Here we're saying, the exchange value is quite important to determine value, but exchange could be broken up into a dialectic also. So we could have relative exchange. So how much is this item worth? Okay, and a lot of times it's quite a confusing conversation, because what is this item worth? Well, there's no tangible law-like system necessarily to tell you what that is, but it's actually equivalent to all these other forms that are existent. Okay? So for example, what is the exchange value of an apple? Well, we could say maybe it's quite similar to that of a pear. But is it that of a chicken, or is it that of other things that maybe we have also put socially necessary labor time into? To determine its equivalency, well, that really depends. Okay? It depends on how much labor time goes into it, but it also depends on how things are equivalent to others in the exchange process. Okay? So in order to determine the relative value of a product, we need to bring it to equivalencies with other things, because in a vacuum, we cannot determine the value of a product. We need to put it in with other products to actually then assess the value of all of these things. So how does this manifest? It actually manifests into money. So relative and equivalent values, instead of going around saying I have 20 shoes, how many jackets this is exchanged for? Well, in a capitalist system, in a lot of systems really, this is quite inefficient altogether. So what we've done is designed this money commodity, or basically the money form, as Marx calls it, that will determine the value based on a price. Okay, so it is the equivalent value of two commodities that are exchanging together. And what we do is we actually determine the value of a commodity usually by stating its money form. Now, why is this important? Is because Marx actually has another term called commodity fetishism. So in Capital Volume 1, especially in the beginning of it, he describes these commodities as lifelike, that are interacting with each other and doing these things in the world that are kind of like human behavior, as if commodities exist outside of us. Okay, so commodities seem to have these like lifelike kind of things, and they have all these values attached to them, and you could actually look at that in the example of KFC. What is KFC? Chicken, sure, or whatever you want to call it. Right now, actually, I would say that in a lot of places in the world, it's actually not really chicken, because it's been manufactured in the lab. But the idea of the commodity is usually about the marketing that goes into it, or all of these other things that abstract from actually understanding the real nature of the commodity. So what is the real nature of a commodity? Well, actually is that there's a lot of socially necessary labor time that goes into the development of it in a concrete and abstract fashion, okay? And most of the time, this is left out of the equation. We're trying to understand the food item itself. So why is this important? Because most of the food items that we're receiving in stores right now are actually under the value of socially necessary labor time that's acceptable for people to live in conditions and be able to flourish, okay? We're driving down the cost of labor as far down as we could, that the people that are company owners, or basically the owners of farms or owners of these big food companies, could actually derive as much surplus profit, or basically surplus from the abstraction of labor. And this is actually quite apparent if we're going to deconstruct our food system in Canada, United States, but also if we look at how we import foods from other countries, this is quite apparent. Okay? So one example being, in Canada, you probably heard, and especially in this course, there's been issues with migrant labor. They're not given the same conditions of labor that Canadians get in the farms that are actually producing the foods that we are consuming ourselves. So, in certain places, there's been major outbreaks when it comes to COVID. In other places, certain people are not allowed to leave because the farmers don't want them to expose them to COVID in certain areas. And actually people that have contracted COVID, there's been reports coming out, I can share them actually on the site if you want, of people that are actually not even being able to meet their own food conditions, and they're the ones producing our food. They're being fed very mediocre kind of things that don't necessarily sustain them in to be able, and their ability to reproduce themselves and their agricultural, production that they're actually doing to produce all these values for our food system. So what happens there is that we're kind of abstracting a lot of, or fetishizing the commodity form and leaving out the aspect of socially necessary labor that's going into producing these products. So what we need to do is actually understand value coming from labor itself, and actually understanding that much of the issue when it comes to food production stems from trying to drive down labor costs and augment efficiency as much as possible. So basically what they call relative value or relative surplus is that we could actually increase the productive capacities by increasing technologies or other things that basically make the working place more efficient. In that case, basically it's easy to abstract or to take away surplus, especially if you've been one of the first to innovate, because then the amount of labor time or other time to produce as many products drops, and you could increase your productivity and basically your surplus value or profitability for the time being until everybody kind of catches up to you and then things equal out again. But anyhow, so there's a continuous drive for capitalists to drive down labor costs and to make labor more efficient, either by augmenting the amount of people that are working in these conditions, or basically paying people with a certain rate and augmenting the amount of time that they have to put into it, which I guess in the times of COVID, when you're working from home, this may be a concern of yours. Your employers may be looking for more time that you're putting into your labor, but without actually paying extra for the time. So they're basically trying to capture more of surplus by extracting more from your labor. Anyhow, so labor is a very important thing to understand, and the food system itself is always trying to make labor more efficient in the way that they could actually derive more surplus for it. And this becomes a problem with our food system, because this drive for efficiency seems to be making a lot of the farms non-solvent anymore. It means that they actually have to adapt their technologies to keep up with the other big farms and put all these kind of chemical items into their food in order to maintain like the other farms are doing, or else they're going to be left behind. So this is just an overview of Marx's first dialectic, but kind of relating this into the food system. And why am I doing this? Actually, this was a big part of especially chapter 2 of Eric Olin Wright and their description of what a food commodity is. So you're going to see some of the terms interchangeable with the ones that he's describing also. Great. So importance of labor. Okay, we need to factor in that labor is a major driving force of how food is produced, and in different ways, labor is one of the most important things that is going into this and actually creating a lot of the issues that we're been discussing about unsustainability. So if we look at the commodification of labor itself, it's quite complex because it doesn't really work like a normal commodity. Okay. So in order to have laborers continuously work, we need to reproduce the labor. So what does that mean? It means that we need to provide conditions for the laborer to be able to subsist, but then also to have their family subsist and other things so that other laborers can come into the labor force. But even pushing beyond that, so that was kind of the basic understanding, and in very primitive forms of capitalism, the idea was just to reproduce the laborer and not worry too much about their livelihoods or other factors that come into play. As long as they're staying alive, that's great. Kind of like work for your daily bread or whatever the conditions were that were able to reproduce the laborer and their offspring at that time. But what we've realized, and especially in the 1900s, kind of stemming after World War I in the United States, and I guess the rest of the world, or whoever was involved in the war. Anyhow, I guess the conditions of reproduction of the labor was not just about their daily reproduction of themselves, but also had to reproduce the things that they could buy in the economy. Because we're producing all of these commodities that workers that are making their livelihood from working in capitalist production also have to be able to purchase, or else these things don't have an effective demand. Basically, they're not able to be purchased in the commodity system. So what does that mean? Okay, look, if we want to have a consumer-based society, which is the case now, people need to be able to spend money into the consumer society, or it comes crashing down very quickly. Okay, if we cannot buy the things that are being produced and there's no effective demand for them, well, then they're not going to be able to be consumed. And if they're not consumed, then we have kind of a break in this production consumption cycle. The other thing, I guess, is that looking at sustainability, we really need to redefine how these things operate, because only producing things for consumption and making them so that they have a lifespan and have built obsolescence makes it a very unsustainable world, because we're producing things that eventually will go to waste or have destructive effects when we throw them away. So labor itself is a commodity that is a process that we've commodified, but it's not like any other commodity. Is that actually, in order for society to function, workers need to reproduce themselves, but they also need to participate in the economy itself as well. And in the COVID days, this is something that governments are going to have to start realizing here. And I know that there's been a lot of pushback on stimulus packages, but the truth of the matter is that people cannot afford their lifestyles anymore. It doesn't matter how much we produce, because if people can't consume it, then the cycle starts to break when it comes to production consumption. So, places like the United States or other places in the world that are not necessarily providing provisions for people to be able to participate in the economy are going to see a very, very big problem occur very soon. Anyhow, so let's get back to food. Talked about relative and absolute value. So relative value, farms and companies are always trying to increase efficiencies through technologies, but also increasing absolute value, with basically making you work more for the amount of money you're getting, so that they could extract more surplus from you by increasing the amount of labor time you have, or basically by putting other laborers in similar conditions and increasing the amount of people in the labor force. So companies want to keep prices low and wages low. So, I guess a lot of you, when you go to the grocery store, and I've heard this from a lot of my students, is that the number one thing they're looking for is low prices. So one of the values that's being strived for a lot of times when people are shopping is about obtaining prices or obtaining food at the lowest price possible. But we need to understand that this makes our system very difficult, because what it does is drive down wage costs to the extent that some farmers don't even make their own livelihoods because their wages are too low. So farmers have been kind of put into or thrown into this context, is that they actually have to subsist by their own farming. So they need to be able to reproduce themselves through their own farming, and then also put some of their stuff on the market in order to make their livelihoods. And for a lot of farmers, it's very difficult. And you'll see in Canada and the United States, there's been a drastic decline in family farming, because it's very difficult to subsist and to be able to be part of the capitalist system if your wages don't match actually the prices of all of the products that are out there. Other things as well. So there are more international mechanisms that keep capitalism going as well. So the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was around from 1947 until 1994, until it turned into the World Trade Organization in 1995, which is the body, basically the international body that regulates trade. And importantly in there is basically during this transition is when the TRIPS agreement was founded. And the TRIPS agreement allows patentable, basically biologically patentable items. So people from this agreement were able to patent genetic structures and seed structures and other things, so that they could actually have the jurisdiction and the rights over them, and basically restrict other people from having them, okay? And here's a number of examples here where Monsanto has sued farmers because their patent cross-pollinated into these farms, and basically, from the perspective of these farmers here, kind of contaminated their crops. But at the same time, what Monsanto claimed is it's not about contamination. It's actually that now they have the genetic patents that we have because of our cross-pollination. Now we own their farm. We own all the products on their farm. So Monsanto has gone and sued farmers, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, basically claiming that the genetic structures that they patented, even though it blew into a territory where the farmer didn't want it, is still under the patentable products of Monsanto. So there's a number of issues that come up, especially when we're looking at commodification of food and privatization. When people claim that this is the way to preserve food and to make sure that the world is going to feed itself, I would say it's quite the opposite, is that it actually is restrictive and makes it so that people don't have access to food, especially, from these examples here. These are quite extreme examples, but, they're not out of the ordinary examples from what these companies have done. is when they patent something, they make sure that they have the jurisdiction over it and they're going to be making the profits from it. So to get into Eric Olin Wright and his description about the capitalist food system, this conversation is rooted in political economy. Okay, so you can see it coming from a very Eurocentric point of view, but with the conditions as that's where capitalism developed mainly, and then has spread out through colonialism. And we can study kind of the colonial context of capitalism and the impact it's had on other civilizations or societies, especially First Nations communities in Canada, or indigenous communities in the States or in other places in the world that had a major impact on the way that they functioned as a society. It also changed the course of the world as well. So, we went from a place where we were relying more on redistribution and reciprocity to one basically where market takes the dominant form. And capitalism is really about producing commodities for the market and trying to assume everything into this process. It's a process that grows continuously and tries to encapsulate all of the different labor efforts and commodity production into the capitalist system. So what are these kind of conditions for capitalism to develop? Well, before capitalism, we had feudal societies, or societies that were ruled by monarchs or rulers, and within feudalism, there were communities of people, and there was like feudal lords or people that were in charge of these kind of kingdoms, or basically the different feudal ranges. But subsistence actually happened communally. So although it wasn't a system of equality, and there was a major issues with feudalist systems, I'm not advocating that that's a better or worse system by any means. I'm just pointing out the course of history. Feudal societies, people were removed from the feudal societies basically through expropriation of their land. So people were told that you can no longer reside within these commons, that now we're going to enclose the commons and force you out, and basically, into different aspects of society, into more urban environments or other places where you'd have to work for industry in order to maintain your livelihood. So how did this come about? Well, if you actually look at Polanyi in The Great Transformation, he has a pretty good description of the history of capitalism, basically kind of describing pre-capitalist, more kind of tribal societies that had nothing to do with real, domination of markets, that were actually more about reciprocity and redistribution than anything else. But then kind of forming into feudalist societies, and production started to accumulate, or not accumulate, sorry, production started to increase, and then we have the development of mercantilism, where different trade routes were established, and people started to trade across different nations. So in trading, going basically to China or the UK or different places throughout the world, and start to establish these different trade routes, mainly for spices or other things like that at the beginning, but then the trade routes start to get more elaborate. And the development of cities, according to Polanyi and other sources, come from these trade routes where there was junction points. So people couldn't just do these trade routes in one day, but actually had these different places where people would settle, and these junction points would come about, and markets developed at these locations. So instead of going, all the way from the UK to China or whatever the case is, to India, there would be these different junction points that were the development of towns and cities. And this is where markets started to form. And because of the formation of markets, this is where capitalism started to flourish, in these junction points, or basically kind of points of where markets were becoming more dominant. Anyhow, so feudalism then changed towards a kind of a more mercantilistic aspect, but people that were the business class, that were not necessarily the ruling class before. And actually in a lot of different places and throughout history, the business class was frowned upon. Basically, if you look at some of the older stories of like, the Christmas Carol and Ebenezer Scrooge and all of these things, capitalists were actually looked upon quite badly, as the accumulation of wealth and capital was not necessarily a positive thing. And if we look at a lot of religions, usury capital, which is accruing money based on lending people money and then charging them interest, was actually against the certain religions. It's not part of Islam religion, it wasn't part of Christianity, and most of the religions actually looked at this very negatively, until it became more acceptable as a form. And there's quite a bit of history that we're not going to get into here, but basically the idea is these were not natural things. They were things that started to take place because of the conditions that were created and also because of violent removal from common lands, and basically people forced into more urban environments and had to force their own labor into these environments also. So what we have is the creating of enclosures. Instead of flourishing in commons, people were locked out of the commons, and a lot of this land that was agricultural land before became the private land of people that were performing agriculture, but basically kind of selling the products that they're producing. And there was a separation from livelihood. So when people are separated from their common lands, well, then they're also separated from their livelihood. And then there was discussion about certain forms of regulations that took place that benefited and didn't benefit farmers, but basically were part of the capitalist mode of production and part of the history of capitalism also. He describes the corn laws. So when countries, or basically sovereign nations, started to trade with each other, there were certain prices that would be able to become cheaper for certain individuals and actually be cheaper than what the farmers were producing in certain environments. And actually in the UK, farmers were very concerned about the prices of corn coming from external markets and put down a law, basically the corn law, is that they're going to charge duties and tariffs on any incoming products so that their farmers could actually compete with these things. And these kind of conditions of regulation have been around since the advent of capitalism. One thing that's actually made capitalism what it is today is basically the definition or defining private property, which has been upheld through regulation and is kind of the cornerstone of how capitalism developed. Anyhow, so there are regulations that came into play to make sure that capitalism also functioned, and the ability for primitive accumulation, basically the starting point of capital, and creating capital in the form of money and commodities and kind of putting them out into the world and circulating them through markets was the beginning cornerstone of capitalism. So this is around the 1600s, depending on where you are in the world. But what happened then is because of people's ability to travel, capitalists started to then go and assume in different places in the world and basically colonize these areas. And you have, I guess, probably heard about North America or understand hopefully about colonialism in North America. But people came over from Europe, conquered areas of North America, basically so-called North America, and imposed restrictions on how people access land. Basically, the indigenous communities here didn't really define property in those contexts, didn't have a definition as private property. So the colonialists came, set up the situation of private property and assumed land based on the definitions that they're providing. So basically usurping people from their own livelihoods by taking land and making it private rather than commons. And the other thing that's quite neglected in this discussion that is very important that we're going to come back to later is the context of slavery. Because you'll hear time and time again, people will say, well, capitalism is better than feudalism or is great in certain ways because what we've done is we've eliminated slavery. Well, at the beginning of capitalism, slavery was quite prominent and actually had led to the development of capital production that we know here in North America especially, but also in other places in the world. Because slaves were brought over from Africa in the aspects of first colonization and were actually put to work on the plants. So plants being whatever you want to call them then, but basically like cotton fields, as well as, to produce food, to produce rice and to produce other things as well. So slavery was a big part of actually the development of capitalism in North America because the slaves provided food to people, as well as, cooked for their masters and other things like that, but also provided, ways of obtaining cotton and other things at no cost, really. Okay, so they're not being paid for their labor, they're being kept in slave conditions. And this is the development of the capitalist nation here in North America and throughout the world. So slavery is a very big part of this, but it's also a very big part too in capital production, because if you have slaves producing food, well, then the cost of reproducing your labor becomes a lot less. So slavery was a big forefront of how capitalists developed and accumulated things, as they relied on slaves to reproduce a lot of the conditions to reproduce their laborers. Okay, and slavery, I would say, to this day, although we may define it in different terms, is quite a big process of our food. We're always trying to drive down the cost of food to conditions where people are barely surviving. And I've given you an example here, but if you look at food that's imported from other countries, a lot of the time we're not paying the true cost of food. We're driving people into conditions where they're having very much trouble even obtaining food through markets based on the price we're paying. So Eric Holt-Gimenez also talks about different food regimes. And this has been discussed by many different authors. You could look at Hannah Whitman, you could look at Desmarais, who we read actually in one of, I think, the second set of readings. But basically what they're looking at is regimes. So they're looking at modes of political economy and modes of capitalist accumulation, or basically, what kind of political economic situation would define the certain era. So the first regime is what Eric Holt-Gimenez calls the colonial regime. So this is where regulations were put in place to uphold private property. Okay, so to make sure that capitalism functioned, there need to be regulation processes. And this is kind of counter to what a lot of people think, is that in order to have capitalism, you need free markets. Okay, if you had your markets completely free, markets would do away with themselves because private property wouldn't be there. So usually when people say we want free markets, their main caveat is free markets with private property. And to me, that's okay. Well, there's already conditions going into this. It's not technically free markets. So what other conditions should we be thinking of that maybe will help in our understanding of making the economy more sustainable for people, the planet, and for ourselves? So regulation was a big factor. So we need to regulate private property. The other thing was about dispossession, because people had access to common territories, common land, and were able to reproduce themselves. But in the context of the development of capitalism, people were expropriated and dispossessed from their land. Technically, one way to look at property is in the way of dispossession, okay? Because people had things even before property was developed. So people had possessions, okay? But possessions were different than property, because property then comes with legal boundaries, as well as deeds and other kind of legal requirements. But to have the private property, especially in land, is people actually need to work on their land, and a lot of the capitalists actually didn't even fit those conditions. Anyhow, so in the bigger picture, people that were the peasants or people that were working on the land were dispossessed and actually forced into conditions of labor for capitalists. The other part of the first regime was exploitation of labor. So the idea is that through capital production, the capitalists don't pay the true value to their laborers because they try to extract some from labor in order to make a surplus or a profit. So laborers that are in the conditions of producing things no longer have access to all of the value that's being produced, but actually give up a good significant portion of that value to people that are the owners of the company. And most of them actually don't even fulfill the conditions of working on their land because they're making other people do it for them. So this is kind of the beginning of the development of the first regime of colonialism, but also there were other aspects that reincarnate into other regimes as well. This is why I put them a little bit lower. So technological development and market expansion. So capital always looks to expand itself and expand markets. You'll see growth in capital, basically GDP growth, that's fluctuating around, depending on the times, maybe around 2% is ideal for a lot of people or a lot of countries when they're looking at growth. But also, even inflation in debt and inflation in basically commodity prices go along with the growth of capital too, which is usually kept at about 2, but depending on where you are in time and space. So market expansion to continuously grow, but also technological development to maintain or to augment the efficiency of labor so that relative surplus could actually be increased. Then the second regime, this is the post-war regime that's being discussed here. And Eric Holt-Gimenez talks about different conditions of war, looking at the state's involvement in the war and saying that Mexico had a large part of producing the food when the United States was actually in the world wars, as well as different kind of conditions of food that actually launched the United States into the war. You could actually go and take a look at the chapter if you want to. But basically, after the Second World War, there were conditions put in place so that people will be able to consume the products within certain environments, especially in the United States and in other places in the world. The United States evoked something called the New Deal. the understanding here is after the market crashes in the 1920s to the 1930s, economists realized that production was not at the forefront of how the economy functioned. It's really easy to mass produce things, and actually you could have overproduction. And if you don't have effective demand, then your economy will not function. Okay, so the idea is here is when you have a major depression or you have conditions where people cannot spend into the economy, well, you need to provide them those conditions. And then the people will become consumers, spend into the economy, and then you can justify the production and things operate more fluidly. So post-war, the New Deal was put in place so that people could actually be able to participate in the economy of the United States. And I guess just to flip this to today, there's been discussions about the Green New Deal in the United States and even in Canada. And basically the idea here is that the disparity between the rich and the poor is getting quite extreme. And some people are not able to participate in the economy. And that's actually not even good for the economy itself. When you have billionaires extracting all this money from the economy and not allowing kind of common people to be able to spend this money in the economy, well, it actually impedes the markets from actually flourishing or, from actually functioning properly. So, the Green New Deal or the New Deal itself, the idea is that we have to then make sure that people are able to participate and have more equality when it comes to what they're getting in the market. But then I guess the Green New Deal, to push it a little bit further, and we can get into the intricacies of it, but it's to do that in a way that is not going to harm the planet in the process, and actually will be more rooted in the social environment rather than just for profit. He also discusses parity for farmers because in conditions of early capitalism, farmers were supposed to subsist on their own farms, and then basically their surplus was the stuff that's supposed to be brought to market. Or this is how a lot of farms function. Some farms are still subsistence-based farms, but there are certain aspects and certain conditions where parity farm parity was put in place. Especially after World War II and the Green New Deal came in, it actually, the government put in different provisions to help farmers out to make sure that they're actually getting the true value or better value for their products than they can otherwise. There's still a big reliance on migrant laborers. So you'll notice actually after World War II, the United States brought in a bunch of migrant laborers, especially from Mexico, to work at under subsistence wages in the different farms. And this continues to today. So Canada is a major culprit when it comes to relying on migrant laborers to undervalue cost. And I'm not saying this in the value of themselves, but undervalue, they're not paying them very well and or putting people in conditions that is not necessarily suitable for labor. And this is what goes into producing our food. So we're not necessarily paying the true cost for our food. And the more that we drive down prices, the more it actually has an impact on laborers, especially migrant laborers. And part of the second food regime was the Green Revolution. So I told you about Borlaug last time and this idea that we need to be more efficient, we need to mechanize, we need to go towards GMOs, and all of these things was to increase the amount of food production so that we could go and feed the world over. Although, when Borlaug was claiming these things, we have not actually solved the problem. The problem's exacerbated a lot more than it was before. And actually, because of the Green Revolution, now private industries have a lot more power than they do, or than they have before, because they've patented, and the smaller farmers have to try to compete with these big, large industries who have access to scale, but also access to efficiency through different mechanized processes. So then the last food regime that is being discussed is the corporate food regime, and we're looking kind of the late 70s onward. Pretty much what we look at here is the development of neoliberal politics. So what is that? Is that in the UK and in the United States, you have people like Margaret Thatcher and you have people like Ronald Reagan who imposed these ideas that we need to go towards a free market economy. Okay? And basically taking from people like Milton Friedman or Van Hayek or other kind of more liberal, what they call liberal thinkers, and impose neoliberalism as a mechanism where they claimed that when the rich get richer, it'll trickle down and people at the bottom are actually going to obtain wealth from this also. Well, what we've realized is actually caused major inequality from the 1970s onwards. there's been a stagnation of average wages, there's been a stagnation of minimum wages, and there's been a major accumulation of top wages. So the 1%, and not even just the 1%, it's like the 1% of the 1% are the ones accumulating the majority of the wealth in most of the places of the world. And then taking that wealth that they've accumulated and throwing that back in basically through different investments and making money just off the capital, not even through their own labor or through other things that they're working on, but basically making money off capital itself. Actually, a really interesting point of view if you want to read, what is the book called? Capital for the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. Okay? He's actually defining different conditions of extending inequality. And one of the major arguments of that book is when capital accumulates more than the increases of wages, well, then you start to have accumulation take place on a very large scale, but the rich people actually are able to accumulate a lot more than people could even assume in wages. And where we are right now is actually we are at a place where the inequality is at a very extreme form, pretty much emulating what happened pre-World War I conditions in Europe. And you could look up something like La Belle Époque is what they call it in France. But these were conditions where some of the most extreme forms of accumulation of wealth happened. And this is what we're seeing right now through Canada, the United States, and through the industrialized world. So this corporate food regime basically is a for-profit regime. We're producing for profit. We're producing food for profit. A lot of the aspects of kind of the rhetoric that's being claimed is that we need to eliminate barriers. We need to eliminate trade barriers. We need to liberalize the economy. The government shouldn't exist. We shouldn't have any rules or regulations, until people realize that that does away with private property, or, having a neoliberal context make it so that people could actually subsidize or have cheap subsidized commodities flood their markets and kind of do away with their own food systems also. So there's major drawbacks and negative consequences that occur from neoliberal societies and for this belief in neoliberalism. Also, we have food monopolies. I've showed you actually the context of these kind of synergies or mergers between some of the big conglomerates like Bayer and Monsanto, Chinachem and Syngenta, Dow and DuPont. So these huge companies are now forming these alliances and basically forming monopolies. And there's discussion about further mergers. These companies are some of the biggest companies in the world. And actually, most of them were chemical weapons manufacturing companies that have now gone into producing pesticides, fertilizers, and seeds. The other big part of this corporate food regime is corporations. So it's no longer, food is not being produced by people anymore. It's corporations that are entities that, have their own definitions through their branding and through all of these other things. Like we discussed KFC. What is KFC? Place that sells chicken, but it's a lot more than that because they give it meaning through all of these things they attach to the marketing and all these ideas that are pretty much fictitious, but we come to believe that this is actually how we define these commodities. And then globalization. So, we live in a globalized world. Oops, I think I spelled that wrong. Sorry about that. Anyhow, you know what I mean? So globalization, we live in a world where we are moving products between different areas of the world. We don't always produce for our own consumption in our local environments, but we actually are producing for other markets and then importing stuff also from other markets. Canada is one of the biggest food producers of the world and food exporters, but we also import a bunch of food also. And it's kind of silly sometimes if you deconstruct this because some of the foods that we're exporting, we're importing the same things. This is not very economical. We could do things and be a lot more efficient if we're actually internalizing our production processes and providing them to markets internally. So these are the food regimes that are being discussed, and it goes a little bit through the history of the development of capitalism, but kind of ends here that we're in a corporate food regime and the different contexts that go into that. So look, I could go into what capitalism is, but I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm just going to mention some things that are important to understand in capitalism. And if you want to ask me questions about this, we could go over this later. So capitalism uses markets. They're in search of profit because the kind of point of their production is to profit and to accrue more surplus and kind of continuously look for that. Uh, the means of production are owned privately. It means that somebody owns the means of production and are then employing other people to do labor that then go and accrue the surplus. But the owners of the means of production are the people that actually have jurisdiction over the surplus. It is a money-based system. Capitalism functions because of the money exchange through the commodity process and would be very difficult if money did not exist. But it's not the defining feature, it's just a feature that actually allows capitalism to flourish because money existed in pre-capitalist societies. Financial markets. So financial markets are a big part of capitalism. So we look at the stock market economy or other things as well. And even food is bought and sold and traded on financial markets. But a lot of the time when we're talking about markets, it's not tangible markets like a farmer's market or any other kind of market, but it's actually markets that are financial markets that are virtual and exist pretty much through numbers on a screen or in paper or in the bank account. Private property is extremely important because without private property, capitalism cannot exist. So basically, it's the context of a legal ramification that private property exists in capitalist areas and actually even integrated into the US Constitution as something that's very important to uphold as private property. And deconstructing this, we could look at other ways that communal property come into play, and ways of alleviating some of the problems with our food system is actually about recommoning or providing more common access to things like land and ways to reproduce ourselves. Alienation. So we've separated ourselves from our own means of production. When people used to make things that were tangible, they no longer do so. They basically kind of forfeited that by working for a capitalist and then assuming they're okay with the wages and are only paid a certain proportion of the extent of what they're making. So they're alienated from their own production capacities, and then they're also alienated from the things that they produce. Exploitation. So part of the surplus that comes from labor goes to the capitalists and actually doesn't come back to the wage laborers. So people had to then assume wage labor. They were forced out of a lot of the conditions of their own reproduction and have to work in conditions of wage labor. Externalities are a big part of understanding, especially when, food and sustainability, because we don't pay the true cost of food. We drive down labor costs that people don't have the ability to subsist very well or participate in the capitalist system. But also, they push out other things like companies don't always clean up some of the destructive habits that they have, dumping nitrogen or having nitrogen run right off into the water and create dead zones. Other things like, loss of biodiversity and all of these factors that come in are considered externalities, but are really some of the major focus if we're actually looking at developing sustainable food systems is to address the externalities and to figure out ways to either internalize them into the productive process or basically kind of decommodify the food production on its own. Expendable workforces. So we have created conditions of expendable workers. Right now, unemployment is quite high in Canada and the United States because a lot of people's work conditions are no longer there. And when you have unemployment to some degree, well, then workers don't have as much negotiating power and they can be taken advantage of quite a bit in capitalist societies. Excuse me. So capitalism is a system of inequality, and it is very difficult to reach conditions of equality. It's not the only system that is unequal, but is a condition that exacerbates inequality, and especially access to markets and financial inequality in today's world is actually becoming more exacerbated than it has for close to about 100 years or so. So advertising is important in the way of understanding commodities, or maybe not important in the way of that, but actually maybe even tricks us to understand commodities in ways that are superficial rather than really understanding them as use values. So consumerism, this whole idea that we need to be part of this consumer market and continuously consume, which is quite destructive for ourselves and the planet at times, depending on what kind of consumption, but especially the types of consumption that we're partaking in right now is quite destructive. So firms or companies are the things that are the major players in capitalism. They're the ones that are actually producing things because they own the means of production. Institutions uphold capitalism, like world institutions, like the World Banks and World Trade Organization and other things as well, and even try to force countries into structural readjustment or structural adjustment policies. If countries owe money to the IMF, they're told actually to open their economies and basically make it so that capitalism will flourish more. So institutions play a big role in actually expanding capital throughout the world. Imperialism also, basically kind of the ability to control people economically and to have jurisdiction over certain territories through economic or military or other realms, which go into colonization. We've taken over different parts of the world and impose these capitalist values. We, talking about Europe especially, has gone into different places in the world and imposed certain values and basically have set up conditions of private property and set conditions that were not necessarily there to begin with in certain places of the world. So colonialism impedes certain people's ability to actually reproduce themselves in the context of what they knew historically or through the conditions that were acceptable by non-Europeans. Exchange is a big process also, because in order to have capitalism, you need people to go to markets and exchange things. What they call free enslaved labor is a condition of capitalism, as people could actually go into the workplace if they want to, although like I was telling you, the conditions of creating capital and even some of the conditions now are based in slavery still. So it still exists, and there are different incarnations of that. Capitalism is a system of cycles and crises. So you're going to see the markets go up and the markets go down. You're going to see, prices inflate and other things that go into these different crises. Right now, it looks like we're in a major crisis, and especially considering unemployment is at quite a high rate right now. And I don't know if people are going to have the confidence or even the effective demand to be able to spend into the economy or whatever the case is to get things going the way it was. Although, I'm not necessarily suggesting we should. I think that there are better ways of understanding this. But capitalism is full of cycles and crises, and used to have longer cycles before the crises occur. At the beginning, we're looking at cycles of about 60 years. And actually, as time goes on, these cycles start to decrease in time. And the last major crisis before today was 2008 in the United States or so. And that was the major kind of economic crisis. And now we're in another one right away, just about 10 years later. So growth is another thing. We need to continuously grow for capitalism to function. Capital, when it decreases or when growth is impeded, then it makes it difficult for capitalists to maintain. Competition is also inherent in the system, although competition is quite rigged because a lot of companies or firms have a lot of access to capital, which kind of puts them in the advantage. And because of that, we've created monopolies and other things. So although competition is seen as a virtue of capitalism, companies don't like competition. They actually would rather not have it. And limited democracy. So we believe that we live in a democratic world and we make all of these decisions. But if we really deconstruct this, our democracy is quite limited. We vote for representatives to then represent us on these large issues. Although we're not necessarily consulted about other things like, we don't have aspects of deciding on budgets or deciding on what comes into the world and not. So there's all these other aspects of democracy. And we could actually look at other forms of democracy, like associational democracy, where unions are actually strengthened and kind of the beginning place of where we start to discuss economics and politics. Or, there are other forms of democracy that are more grassroots forms of democracy, where we have people actually making decisions about things coming from their local environments and are able to participate in more of the democratic process rather than just electing people. So look, this was a lot of things that I just kind of spewed out here. And what I want you to get from this is I want you to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about capitalism, especially in the context of food, and especially in the context of food being a commodity of capitalism and part of this capital cycle. Because when we're looking at sustainability, we're going to need to address a lot of these things, because a lot of these things make it so that our food system is not sustainable for social functioning or environmental functioning. Basically, it has negative effects on us and the biosphere. And a lot of these conditions that I'm naming here have these detrimental effects. And some of these things are going to need to be addressed. And actually, if you look at the argument of Jimenez, he's saying capitalism is the cause of a lot of the problems that exist, especially in food. But what we seem to do is only address the symptoms of the problem or the way that they manifest. So, we could look at trying to feed the world by increasing production, but we're looking at the wrong problem because we have more than enough food to feed the world over. So, it's not necessarily about producing more, but providing more access or providing people with the livelihood conditions that allow them to be able to participate in the economy, like people that are the kind of the major consumers of food in, our societies, like in Canada, United States, or other kind of more industrialized places of the world. So these are the conditions that we actually need to start to address. Now, I don't want to get too much into this because this wasn't part of the readings, but I just want to introduce you to other ways of understanding these things. So we could readdress and reappropriate commons and basically, provide people with the opportunity to start reproducing their livelihoods again. So how do we do that? Well, there's an interesting book called Take Back the Economy by Gibson Graham and colleagues that wrote this. And basically what they're looking at is readdressing some of the issues and recommoning some of the private property and providing people access to these things and understanding that there's more commons that exist that maybe we're not thinking of. So they're talking about different forms of commons. So we have biophysical commons that exist naturally. There are things in the world like, pastures and forests and soil and all of this stuff. We have cultural commons, so things shared by members of the same culture. So rituals, activities, other things. We have social commons. We have ways that we could actually bond as a system and have some kind of a social contract together. And then we also have knowledge commons also. So knowing things, we could actually know about the world without actually commodifying the knowledge process. There's all of these forms of commons that we could, put or make flourish again, rather than privatizing these things, we could actually put them back into ways of decommodifying and basically providing access to people. So people might say, well, that's all said, good and done, but there's major problems that come into play. Some people will look at what they call the tragedy of the commons as a story and say, well, we give people all access to certain common territories, well, they're just going to exploit it and do away with it and make it so that the conditions are not accessible to others. I would actually say that if you really deconstruct the story of the tragedy of the commons, that actually describes free market capitalism very well. Okay, to the extent that if we don't regulate free market capitalism, it's going to destroy the way that we associate with each other and the way that we actually perform economics or in an economic situation. But there are different ways to access commons. So we can look at access. Okay, to have a commons, certain things must be shared widely. We could look at the use. It must be negotiated by a community. Okay, so it's not just that it's a free for all, but actually that we could think of things as like land trusts or ways that it's negotiated amongst different members of a community. Okay, so it could be like common territories and stuff that's shared amongst different people. So the benefit should be distributed to the people that are actually taking part in the commons. Okay, so it means that if there's some kind of benefit, if you have like a farm or producing food, well, then the benefits should go to the people that are actually part of the commons and not, privatized or commodified and put back into the market. But there's different care that needs to go in as well. So you need to make sure that things are kept well and things are taken care of. And, the way to do so is that the people that are accessing these things and negotiating amongst the community could care for their local environments and make sure that it's kept well. And actually assume responsibility over it as well. So there is a group of people that are actually responsible for these things and make sure that the conditions are upheld, that people could actually, go and take part in different aspects or take part in the commons themselves. And property must be collectively owned rather than privately owned. And one way to look at this is especially the means of production. If we start to put the means of production into common territory, well, then we could actually start to share the products of labor. What does that mean? Well, the development of co-ops, or actually, if you look at a very specific example in Montreal, Bâtiment 7, okay? There's a number of different co-ops that reside in this area. but the means of production are communally shared amongst the people that are part of the co-op. Means that if you become a member, you actually have access to the commons, which is the means of producing whatever it is. So there's examples of Le Détour, which is a grocery store. Members have access to cheaper prices and the store itself and decision-making and other things. La Sainte Taverne is a tavern. Basically, it's a bar in Bâtiment 7 that the workers are members and actually decision makers as to how the co-op collectively functions. And anything that comes from it is part of the commons and part of the collective ownership of the co-op members. So these are ways to rethink this whole idea of commodification and privatization. And to end with, I provided a very interesting perspectives here by Vandana Shiva on this topic. And I would highly encourage you to go to these videos and take a look and see what she has to say. And also to read the chapters that I talked to you about, basically Eric Holt Gimenez, especially the introduction, chapter 1 and chapter 2, which describes a lot of what I was talking about in this lecture here. And we're going to be moving on from these topics, but you're going to notice throughout the book and throughout the lectures that a lot of these topics are going to be revisited also.